There are some huge stories in the news today, many of which have me absolutely irate. My blood is boiling, and I have conservative talk show host Jason Rantz with me to go through this. Jason, thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So, just some background on you. You host a conservative talk radio show out of Seattle. You're also an author, very prolific writer online, and I enjoy your online perspective about our country and politics. I want to jump right into a story. I don't know if you saw this. It's kind of breaking news, but Mayor Eric Adams of New York announced a new program to give $10,000 to migrants in New York. They don't need any ID. They don't have to speak English. They don't even have to prove who they are. They just have to show up and request the money and stand in line. Now, in your estimation, how big of a slap in the face is this to tax-paying New Yorkers, New Yorkers struggling to buy groceries, people that have paid into the tax system their whole life? Also,
hmm
any chance that this 10,000 just happens to be the amount that most people owe the Mexican cartel? I mean, what are your thoughts on this breaking story?
Well, it's not merely a slap in the face, it's a guarantee that this is going to continue to occur, right? I mean, on the one hand, you've got Mayor Eric Adams finally speaking out in a more forceful way about how the illegal immigration crisis and the porous border is impacting his city, and in his own words, making it unrecognizable. So you've got that, which is great politically for him, and obviously it is a view that's shared by New Yorkers. Then you pivot to this, which is let me give another reason for people to come to New York City. Let me give another reason for someone who's coming into this country illegally, trying to set up a life, which, by the way, I totally understand. I get why someone wants to come into this country, both legally and illegally. Certainly now, I think all of us understand why there is now an incentive to come into this country illegally. And so if you're just a taxpayer, if you're a New Yorker who's sick and tired of the crisis that this is creating on the streets, which is not merely just overcrowding and what looks like way worse homelessness, it's a crime crisis, it's a housing crisis, it's a resource crisis. You're seeing more of your resources being taken away from your communities and given to people who are in this country illegally as a present for coming into this country illegally. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's like so I used to do physician staffing many, many years ago, and we would work with hospitals in Alaska, Guam, Wyoming, where it was really hard to get good medical providers to go. And one of the ways that they would incentivize them is while you're there, we'll pay off some of your student loans through the hospital
Yep.
profits, right? And that would usually get a provider to go because they were carrying, this debt. I think you're absolutely right. This is more than a slap in the face to New Yorkers. This is a middle finger to the citizens, and yet it's a flashing green light to if you make it to America, get on that bus from Greg Abbott and get to New York because we'll pay off the Mexican cartel. We'll also put you up in a posh hotel. We'll give you $1,000 a month. We'll cover all of your food costs. I don't know why more New Yorkers aren't losing their mind over this. They seem to be fine with it. In fact, they're ready to vote Joe Biden in again and keep this policy going.
Yeah, I certainly believe that there has been a shift in the way some Democrats think. If it's not on this issue, Israel's bringing up a whole lot of different issues for a lot of voters. I don't think it's nearly enough at this point to show a significant enough change, not on a level of New York, but where it does matter and where this is going to come into play come this next election. We're talking about congressional races. We're talking about on a district level. This will start moving the needle. There's a little bit of a built-in benefit to taking these positions without losing too many people from a Democrat perspective because you've got such a large population of Democrats where this is happening. I mean, there is a reason why Greg Abbott is saying, no, we don't want folks here in Texas. We're going to put them into these big liberal cities. He's not merely targeting liberal cities that are sanctuary cities, because if that were the case, Seattle would be having a bunch of illegal immigrants being bussed here by Abbott. He's specifically targeting the areas that have large populations, are obsessively and insufferably progressive, and saying, okay, now it's your problem to deal with. And it's going to start shifting slowly the demographics from Democrat to more maybe moderate independents. But I think at the end of the day, you still have folks who don't just vote on one single issue. Immigration is starting to change that a little bit for some voters, but I don't think that's exclusively what they're going to vote on. And when you're dealing with really institutionalized progressivism, right? Systemic progressivism, it's not going to change overnight, regardless of the issue. But I do clearly think that the polls certainly suggest that demographically, votes are starting to shift, and it's going to end up hurting Biden and Democrats in the long, excuse me, in the long run, but maybe not in the short term.
Gotcha. Okay, that's good commentary on that. Um, Also, this morning, a new leak out of the White House shows that Joe Biden is seriously considering using executive authority to close the southern border, as they believe it will help him get reelected. First, how shameful that Biden would only protect us in the name of getting reelected. And second, doesn't this prove that Joe Biden has been lying over the last 60 days, saying he has no authority to protect the southern border and the United States, when in fact he's now openly admitting that he could literally stroke the pen
Yeah.
and solve this problem overnight? What are your thoughts on this leak?
I think critics of the president have pointed this out for a very long time, right? I mean, obviously, it kind of depends on what the executive order actually is, because there is a problem, particularly with presidents of both parties saying, I'm going to extend the line of what we can get away with from an executive order. So I will, give a little bit of a caveat. But ultimately, we know that he has some of the power because he was already using that power to get rid of some of the Trump era policies that prevented this from occurring in the first place. We knew from the beginning that this was all intentional. He is intentionally keeping this border porous. There are a lot of political reasons behind it. There are a lot of financial reasons behind it. It was actually Marsha Blackburn, the senator from Tennessee, who got me to start thinking about this slightly differently. And she made the point that what are we now having a move towards with the census? Counting people who are in this country illegally or undocumented. Well, you use that census data for funds and for expanding the amount of representation you have in Congress. And so if all of a sudden we're looking at it through that lens, well, it's starting to make a little bit more sense. I think ultimately the long game, Democrats believe, I don't know if this is smart reasoning, but they believe that allowing more people into this country illegally will create an unbeatable voting bloc. I don't know if that's true. I don't know how many people coming into this country illegally are going to say, oh, well, I'm going to vote for Democrats forever, because they still come with certain values around family, around religion, which I think are in conflict with a lot of what Democrats, certainly progressive leaders, believe. But that's their reason here. They did this intentionally. Now they're saying, oh, well, maybe we ought to do something. We'll do something when you at least acknowledge that there's a crisis at the border, which, by the way, they still haven't really expressly done. They don't tell us when this crisis began. They don't tell us what the crisis actually is. They're speaking in these more general terms because they're looking at the polling. And the polling very clearly suggests that on immigration, which right now happens to be the number one issue in the presidential campaign, I don't know if it'll stay like that, but that's what it is. And so now they're starting to pivot. They gave this pretty unreasonable deal in the Senate. It wasn't awful. There were aspects of the border deal that I supported, but ultimately it was still too permissive. And they knew that Republicans were not going to back it. So this is all being driven by politics. The second that he signs that executive order, or he actually talks about it publicly instead of relying on leaks, you would expect or hope that the media will do its job and start asking these questions. But I don't think they're going to.
Yeah, no, they're not. They're not. And,
Yeah.
and I just had Todd Bensman on. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a border expert, but he was able to show me how the Biden administration is secretly and quietly pressuring Mexican President Obrador to use the Mexican military to basically round up people on the northern part of Mexico, put them in buses, and make them start their journey over again in the southern part of Mexico. And what did that do? It slowed the number of people crossing, so that when the media was talking about it and Biden was saying there was no problem, the numbers that week were much lower. And so, there is this secret war in Mexico going on, but it's not to better the country. It's just a better image, his image. Another one that I wanted to talk to you about is former White House press secretary Jen Psaki, who now works for MSNBC. She and former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi speculated on MSNBC yesterday that Russian President Vladimir Putin must have financial blackmail over Donald Trump. It's the only thing that explains why Putin would not be hard on Trump and Trump not hard on Putin. Now, Pelosi said it's obvious that Putin has something over Trump. It's most likely financial and that he needs to be investigated again. She also said that Trump is a man without values that must be kept from the White House at all costs. What are your thoughts on their back and forth interaction on Trump and Putin?
It's the same old, right? I mean, they use the same exact line for the entirety of Trump's presidency. The same thing. He's a Russian asset. Vladimir Putin has something on him. They never tell us what it is. They hint around these improprieties that just so happen to demand an investigation. If you're truly going to find out what it is, then they investigate, they find nothing, and then they say, oh no, it's time to investigate again. You're going to hear the same talking points get pulled out every single day for the rest of this campaign, right? And it's a variety of the exact same thing. So it'll be about Putin, it'll be about Russian assets. We're going to hear the new everything is racist is going to be everything is now a direct threat on democracy. Okay. They kind of brought that in during this last election, right? And even over the weekend, you heard from Hillary Clinton say, if he's given the opportunity, Trump will stop at nothing to install an authoritarian government. Why didn't he do it the first time? Yeah. He clearly had the same amount of power that he would moving forward. It's just so silly. And I think, look, at the start, it worked because Joe Biden did not have a track record, certainly not as a president, right? And no one looks at the vice presidential record with any seriousness. So people saw him being portrayed as, again, this was happening during the chaos of COVID early on. This is the guy who's the adult. He's the unifier. Listen to him. He says he's a unifier. He's a calm, likable personality, the way that you might like your grandpa, because he's just very down to earth and sweet, maybe a little bit doddering, but not enough people saw that. Well, they can't hide that anymore. Now he's clearly got a record that people don't like. They have something to compare it to with Donald Trump. And just from an economic standpoint, financially, you look at how you were doing financially under Donald Trump versus now, and it's objectively clear that people were better off back when Trump was in the White House. Now, you know, people can argue whether or not he was the one responsible. I think generally his policies were, not always. Sometimes things just happen, and there's more than just the president. But you can certainly see where a president or an administration can turn things in the opposite direction. And I think under Biden, we've definitely seen that. And I think it coincides very clearly with the rise of progressives and the socialist part of the Democrat Party on all sorts of issues. I think Democrats who are more quote unquote mainstream or more moderate, I think they're a better reflection of where Democrat voters are than progressives like an AOC or Rashida Tlaib, Eric Swalwell. And all of a sudden, the power has just been ceded to them. And short term, people didn't really see what it was that conservatives were saying. But now I think it's pretty clear because we're all living the reality of progressivism in charge. I mean, I literally wrote a book about these very policies that are destroying individual cities, and people are now awake to what's happening. They're no longer being able to be kept in the dark because media might not cover something, but you know whether or not your city is taking a wrong turn, and you know whether or not a candidate is going to be influenced by Vladimir Putin and democracies online. Like, we're just not falling for that anymore.
Yeah. Oh man. Okay, you're originally a New Yorker. You may still consider yourself a New Yorker.
What are your... I do not. No. I definitely do not. No, I have rejected the East Coast mentality. I'm now very much more laid back West Coaster, and I've been. I was born in New York, but I grew up on the West Coast, Los Angeles. So I consider myself more of a West Coaster at this point.
Gotcha.
I don't think I have the personality to be an East Coaster.
You'll be in good company. Number one city that watches me is New York, and the number two city is Los Angeles. So we'll speak to the Los Angeles people. So
I love all the New Yorkers, though. I'm fighting for you all the time.
So what are your thoughts on this nearly $450 million settlement that Judge Arthur Engoron of New York has levied against Donald Trump? $350 million in fines and then fees, penalties. By the time you add it all up, it's almost $500 million. New York just ironically changed their law a few months before this, where you can't do 10% down with a bond. You now have to put up 100% of the money. Trump's going to have to, sell golf courses, hotels, executive office suites. If he wants to go after this, he's going to have to regardless, right? What are your thoughts on all of this? Has this been a fair ruling? Is this the weaponization of the Attorney General's office of New York?
I mean, when you have an attorney general whose entire campaign, or a good chunk of it, was about going after Donald Trump, I think it's very clearly the weaponization of the attorney general's office. And we're seeing that more generally in other states, including Georgia. We're seeing it at a federal level. But I think anyone who's familiar enough with real estate transactions, and I have some familiarity, but I listen to and read the experts on this. And I think actually Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank has been a really great voice on this particular issue. He says, push aside Donald Trump for a moment. Just completely ignore him. Literally everyone in real estate and banking engage in the exact same transactions. This makes complete sense. It's being done every single day in every single transaction. So we can look at this in one of two ways. Number one, we can say, well, everyone's going to now be a target, which would completely upend the real estate industry and banking. Or number two, we're going to say, okay, probably doesn't impact anybody else because this is a vendetta against Donald Trump. Both of those scenarios are awful. Both of those scenarios are supposed to be protected from occurring in a criminal justice system that is not being abused. And so ultimately, we're going to see how this ends up on appeal. Obviously, he is appealing. And my guess is, because of point number one, which is it happens all the time, literally everyone in real estate is doing this, it's going to be rejected. Because if it's not, the implications are far greater for the industry. And it's not even just in New York, right? I mean, this is going to happen across the country if this is allowed to stand. Of all the issues that folks could have gone after Donald Trump, this ranked probably near the bottom of the ranking list of seriousness, and yet he gets hit with this nearly $500 million fine. It's just ludicrous, and it's clearly an abuse.
Yeah. Well, Letitia James, like you say, she ran on that. She's going to want to try to run on that again. That
Yep.
she's the person that got orange face Donald Trump and took down his empire, blocked him from doing business in New York. But you're absolutely right. Like, I've had to refinance the home I live in. I had to buy the home I live in. I had to put up all my financials. I had to say what I thought my assets were worth. I had to say what I thought the house was worth. At the end of the day, the bank told me, this is what we believe it's worth, and this is all we're willing to lend on. And so no bank is just going to accept anybody's valuation on something. They're going to go do their own third-party appraisal and valuation.
Yeah.
And if those people,
unless you undervalue,
yeah,
then they'll take it at face value. They won't even do anything around it. And that's really, at the end of the day, you look at this, and again, people made this point. Who is the victim? Who was the victim? Everyone got paid. Everyone got exactly what they were owed. So there's no actual victim here, with the exception of the person they're going after.
yeah, yeah, it's wild. Okay, speaking of big money, Joe Biden has raised $130 million to run for re-election. Trump has raised about that much, but they've depleted over $50 million with all of these lawsuits against him. How is Biden running with a low 30s approval rating and still raising so much money? It does worry me because I've heard at the end of the day, whoever spends the most money usually becomes president. I mean, that's not every time. But Biden has a significant chunk of change to get himself reelected. Is there any chance we're getting 4 more years of Biden?
There's always a chance, right? I mean, it's an election. The media plays a huge role in narratives that are shared by the general public. And I say this to my radio audience all the time. The people who listen to me every single day for 4 hours, people who watch you and listen to you, they are the outliers. They're not the average American. The average American is not consuming news 24/7. They're not on Twitter. They're not checking their Facebook page. They're not, nerding out on the public access channels to our state legislature, right? They're living their lives. They will watch the news maybe once a night, but it's mostly going to be local. They're not really going to get any of the national coverage the way that they ought to. And so that means we've given a lot of power to the media to translate what's going on in the real world and give it to the audience so that they can make up their own minds. And what I think we've clearly seen is not just a shift far to the left in reporters, but clearly a bias against Donald Trump. There's no doubt that he broke a lot of these people, and they are now reporting it that way. And so if the average person who isn't consuming the news 24/7 and isn't checking a bunch of sources is only getting it from what effectively would be deemed, I think, a corrupt media in general, then anything can happen. I think that's part of the reason why Biden is terrifying Democrats, is because when he's out there, people have access to him and can see him. And there's no amount of spin that is possible to make it seem like he's got his mental faculties in order, that he is capable of doing this job. But even then, it's still being seen by a limited number of people. So at the end of the day, it's about who can get the narrative in front of as many people as humanly possible. And sometimes the narrative is simply experiencing something and knowing what you're being told is a lie. And on so many issues like the border, on crime, on homelessness, that's where it's starting to bite the Democrats. When they had the media on their side and people were staying at home and didn't realize truly what was going on in their own neighborhoods, you saw Democrats benefit. But the more, you're seeing people experience the opposite of what they're being told and saying, oh, I am being a victim of gaslighting, that's when they start to push back. And I think certainly on a local level, we've seen, I'll give you an example. In Seattle City Council, prior to this last election, very, very, very far to left, like radical, insane. Makes me uncomfortable to even say I live in Seattle because I know the implications. But this last election, after being told that crime isn't a problem, and yet we hit a record high number of homicides in Seattle last year, after being told homelessness is not really a problem, despite the fact we have more homeless people living outside. And weirdly enough, having to spend more dollars to live in the city, people started saying, okay, maybe we went too far to the left. We have to course correct. And they certainly put into office what appears to be a more moderate council. Now, whether or not they govern that way, it's too early to tell. But certainly the writing was on the wall in this last election. And I think people are starting to come to terms with it. So we just have to hope that more and more people experience, as bad as that sounds, but truly experience what's going on in their own communities, the negatives. When that happens, that's when you'll start to see a shift. But if that doesn't happen and you're just relying on the media coverage, well, guess what? It's going to cause some problems. And let's be clear, as much as I like Donald Trump and voted for him the last time, we'll vote for him again. He causes some problems unnecessarily. He does. And that's part of his personality. That's part of the reason why I think a lot of people like him, is because he's very brash. He tells you what he means. But politically, that's not always the best when you're trying to move moderates or independents to your side. And there are a lot of people who are just still uncomfortable with Donald Trump because of his personality. Now, I think ultimately the benefits of living under Donald Trump versus under Joe Biden will overcome some of those concerns about personality. But when he sticks to a script, he comes off as incredibly presidential. I think that he makes everyone proud if he didn't have the sort of the baggage that people ascribe to him. So he's got to be a little bit more nuanced in some of the politicking. I don't think he does nuance very well. I don't think he and again, that's part of the charm, is that he's not playing people unless he's purposefully trolling. But the purposeful trolls, even though you and I might get it and people are watching might get it, doesn't always translate to the average person. And that's where he causes some problems unnecessarily for himself.
Yeah. No, that's true. All right. You've got this book out, What's Killing America. So tell us why you wrote it, what we're going to learn reading it.
I wrote What's Killing America because I recognize in the course of doing my radio show, talking on Fox News, writing, that the same policies were popping up everywhere. They were maybe phrased a little bit differently, but the same kinds of policies were popping up and leading to the exact same consequences. I often say on my show, which is Seattle-based, which is bad policies of Seattle don't stay in Seattle. This is not Las Vegas. What happens here doesn't stay here. It ends up spreading. And before you know it, I was getting text messages from folks who moved out of Seattle to escape the crime and the homelessness and whatnot, saying, oh my God, it's now here. The same exact thing is happening in New York, Los Angeles, Houston, Chicago, the list goes on and on, where a bad policy ends up getting adopted because progressives happen to be very, very good at organizing and branding, and it starts to spread. And so when you think you can escape some of the bad policies, well, you really can't. And number two, the problem is the way some of these things are written and presented on a variety of topics, which I cover in the book, is very, very misleading. Here's an example. I think anyone who's being told about something called harm reduction as a way to go after drug abuse, in particular homeless drug addicts, sounds great. This is how it's presented. Wouldn't you love the idea of a strategy that mitigates the effects of this deadly addiction so that we can keep someone alive to get them the treatment that they deserve? You would say, of course, that sounds great. And on paper, it sounds awesome. Here's what it actually means. When they say harm reduction, they mean they're handing out needles, they're handing out fentanyl pipes, they're handing out something called booty bumping kits, which I got to explain what a booty bumping kit was to about 3 million people on Tucker Carlson when it first popped up. That was fun. Once you start telling people that it actually has nothing to do with treatment, that they're not putting resources into treatment, they're putting resources into drug paraphernalia that simply enable the drug user. Well, the second you pitch it that way, they're like, well, that sounds awful. That's not harm reduction. That's quite the opposite. But it's pitched in a way that sounds like it's appealing, like sounds like it's going to lead to a better society and treatment for people. That's just not the case. And I go down the list in this book of all the ways the left uses language to their advantage. And when you have control of the language, which culturally the left does, they're redefining words left and right. Male and female no longer mean what you think. Violence no longer means what you think. So when you have control of the language, you control the debate. And it's very easy to win these debates when no one really challenges you. And I didn't see enough challenges happening and connecting the dots. So I decided to write the book.
Oh, that's great. That's great. I'm going to leave a link to that down below so that people can go check it out real easily. Final question for you. Biden is losing on the economy. He's losing on housing affordability, grocery affordability. He's losing on crime. He's losing on foreign policy, safety, immigration, and the southern border. I'll admit he will likely win on the stock market and on abortion. What do you think is going to be his main message going into the final months of the election? And what do you think Trump's final message will be heading into the election?
So you're going to have two messages. Number one, abortion. He's going to focus on that because it is proven to be a winner for Democrats, including in some red cities, counties, and states. The folks on the right, and I consider myself very much pro-life, but I certainly understand my personal preference on this is not always the politically smartest way to go. And so folks who are very stringent on their pro-life positions, they're hurting the party. Ultimately, if you moderate just a little bit, at least in what you're willing to do in the short term, you'll win the long-term battle. You're just not going to win anything in between. And if you can't get to that point where you're at least in control, you're not going to have any significant wins. So I think we have to moderate on the messaging a little bit around abortion, or just at least be better equipped to respond to concerns that the pro-life position is too extreme. And I think that we have a lot of great points on our side. We're just not making them effectively. And then he's going to lean on the threat to democracy. You're going to start hearing even more of that. And again, I think it is a foolish talking point, but they're going to look at what they did beforehand and say, well, it worked then. It's going to work now. I think when you read some of the behind the scenes goings on, when you see some of the leaks, clearly Democrats are concerned. And they don't think that the talking points, even around abortion, will ultimately help for Joe Biden. You've got Kamala Harris out there, who's also just a huge vulnerability for this president. You're going to have a focus. If I'm Donald Trump, you make a strong vice presidential pick, not someone who's simply going to be the counterbalance per se and just agree with everything you say, but someone who might even challenge you on some circumstances. You make the right choice there. Someone who's competent. You focus. If I'm Donald Trump, I'm focusing on two things: the economy under his presidency and his vice president. Because everyone on the left, or who might be considering voting for Joe Biden, is going to look to Kamala Harris. And they're going to ask their question, the same one they asked when Sarah Palin was picked as the vice president. Is she capable of the job day one if she had to step in? And honestly, if you're looking at Joe Biden, you're probably thinking she might have to step in, probably going to have to step in. And I think the answer is clearly no. So you have to meet that question and that answer with someone who can provide an answer of yes, this is the person, male or female, regardless of gender, regardless of religion, all those things. Just pick someone who can do the job. And I think you automatically win that. So Trump focus on economy, focus on vice presidential pick. And obviously, whatever the issue of the day is, I don't mention immigration yet because I don't know if that's going to be the leading issue in a few months. I didn't think it would be the leading issue now. I knew it was a concern. I've got an entire chapter about what illegal immigration does to cities, especially around crime. But I didn't think it would be the number one vote. But the fact of the matter is, the economy for people who are not barely getting by, but sort of just maintaining, they're going to feel more comfortable than if they were coming from behind and really struggling every single day. So they're focusing elsewhere. And, regionally, crime is probably going to be an issue. Drug use in the Pacific Northwest, for example, is going to be a huge concern. But unfortunately, a Republican will not win in the Pacific Northwest. But all these other states, I think it's popping up. And I think that clearly Donald Trump has a better track record than Joe Biden. And so if you focus on that track record versus track record, VP versus VP, I think it benefits Donald Trump.
Yeah. Okay. One more question. Throw out a couple of names. Who do you think he might pick as vice president?
I think Tim Scott is high on that list. It's a very smart choice, politically speaking. He's very competent. He's got a great backstory. He's incredibly likable, and he's just a smart guy. I think most people look at him and say, okay, this is, and frankly, it's the same way that people looked at Mike Pence. I know that there are different feelings now, but when he was chosen, why did people really like that pick? It was because he was seen as the quote unquote adult in the room, the person who knows how to run things. He comes from an establishment position, but also shares values. He's very likable. He might be a little bit boring, but you certainly don't look at him and say, oh, he offends me. You didn't do that. Tim Scott, I think, is a better version of that across the board because he's got a personality. Mike Pence didn't really have a personality, but that's kind of what people liked about him. Tim Scott has a great personality. And he's very smart, very likable. And from a conservative perspective, he's got it. I think they're probably, and the funny thing is, he probably would have been looking at Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis if things did not go the way that they did. And I think that a DeSantis on a Trump ticket is an easy win. Frankly, I think a Haley with Donald Trump is an easy win because it's not at that point about leaning into conservatives. Conservatives are going to vote for Donald Trump. He doesn't matter who he chooses, right? They're going to stick with Donald Trump and they're going to be loyal. How do you move people in the middle? How do you get some of the moderate Republicans who are uncomfortable or the moderate Democrats or really the majority of Americans who are, I sometimes vote Republican, sometimes vote Democrat. How do you move them to your side? Nikki Haley would have checked off that box. I think Kristi Noem is probably a reasonable choice. There's some talk about the New York Congresswoman. I don't know if she's a big enough name at this point to move the needle, even though I personally like her. I think she would be great. But I do think that Tim Scott is probably at the top of that list.
Interesting. Well, I knew this would be a great conversation. I appreciate you coming on. I'm going to put a link to What's Killing America down below. Jason Rantz, thank you so much for coming on. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.